clubs and are just very, very good players all round.
It kind of felt like a player who came back from that successful time with the Knights as kind of like a more professional kind of player, kind of with Leeds and them back at Hull, kind of I guess seeing in a new breed a little bit with Hull's kind of resurgence after the non-merger and those things and getting back into Super League. So maybe a bit more of a professional type of player. What about Richard Swain, who I guess really followed him, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, Swain was sort of the consummate professional in many ways, or that's how he seemed on the pitch. I'm not 100% certain about off the field. But, you know, I mean, a New Zealand international player, it felt like it was a real statement when we signed him, I think.
He was one of the most consistent players of that era, and it was an era where Hull became competitive, wasn't it? You won a Challenge Cup, you got to a grand final whilst he was there.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, really, he should have won the man of the match, the Lance Todd, for if nothing else, just for that charge down of the Leeds attempted drop goal at the end.
Yeah, big moment, big players appear.
Yeah. I mean, he did say afterwards that, you know, the only reason he did it was because he knew he didn't have the energy to play an extra 10 minutes of extra time. So he knew he had to stop it.
Tim, it's the first fan view, and it's the first mention for Roby, for Cunningham, for Newton. Newton's thuggery counting against him when we're looking at a great. I mean, obviously Terry Newton's last game for Wigan made Sean Long permanently curious, didn't it? But other than that, wasn't he just a typical hooker? Was he really that different to Cunningham? He used to take people's knees out in the days before Wigan were apparently the only team that did that. And, you know, players go further back into the past, people like Benny Elias, who got people sent off by pretending they're bitten him and, you know, those sorts of things. Wasn't Newton just proper out of the mould?
I thought so, yeah, thinking about this, that sort of rings for me, because I can't think he's any dirtier than a lot of hookers of the same vintage, and certainly those before him. And then he kind of used it as part of his game as well, in a way. He sort of used it to get his edge, to wind people up, and I think it was a skill for him as much as it was
game.
Yeah, and it was definitely, it wasn't like something that he was doing innately. It was deliberate to an extent, but it was something he used to get an advantage, and I kind of respect that. It's similar sort of way that you some of the things that Cam Smith has done, you know, he's only doing to try and get an advantage.
Well, you mentioned
it's kind
Cam
of the
Smith.
same way.
Why don't you read out what Lee Whitnell had to say?
Yeah, he says, for fitness, impunity to injury, ruck control, game management, kicking game and leadership, it has to be Cam Smith. He hasn't mentioned he's a grubby so-and-so. But for heart pumping and exhilaration and joy, it has to be Darryl Clark, whose performance in the 2019 Challenge Cup final is my favourite.
Right, I mean, Sarah, I know you don't watch tons of NRL, but everyone has a begrudging respect for Cam Smith, don't we? I mean, just to read out some of the guys' accolades, is won the Dally M twice. Is the only hooker who's done that. He's won the Golden Boot twice. He's the only hooker who's ever done that.
He's been referee of the year 7 times running.
So, Sarah, I mean, we couldn't have this conversation without Cameron Smith being involved.
If you say so.
If we say so.
Like genuinely, I don't watch Australian rugby. I really couldn't tell you a lot about him.
Fair enough. Well, what about Darryl Clark?
I couldn't pick him out of a lineup.
Well, I think that's what kind of Cam Smith's always kind of been. It's amazing that he's stood out so much over all these years, when kind of his nickname was the accountant, wasn't it? You know, he just looks like a guy who works in an office. When you see him walk out onto the pitch, he never seems to do anything with other than argue with referees. He never seems to do anything with huge like speed and enthusiasm, but is always there. He always does everything. It's remarkable how everywhere he always is when you kind of don't see him get there. It's almost the opposite to Darrell Clarke, who we're going to talk about in a second, who's like absolutely all action, and you can't help but miss him jumping out a dummy half and running around throwing an offload, making three marker tackles in a row with all his energy and that sort of stuff. Cam Smith's the ultimate conserver of energy, yet he still does so much.
And I think the thing with Cam Smith is just you would not want to play against him, because he's got that armory both sides, and he can do, he can do pretty much everything. He had kicking game as well, and he just had that innate ability to pick out a pass, and just, you can't, he's so good in that respect that he's just horrible in others as well. T deliveries coming in.
You had in that he's the record point scorer in.
Thank you.
He's the bruiser eye for Tim. Record point scorer in the NFL, in the NRL history.
Exactly,
add that into the mix.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Wonderful kicker, very professional. I think if you had to sum up the professional era in the NRL, he's probably your I would say your poster boy, but you wouldn't really want him on a poster because, as you say, he does look like a bank clerk.
Really boring, yeah. Darrell Clarke, second fan review, second mention for Darrell Clarke. Obviously not a shock when Lee's a Warrington fan, but I really, really enjoy watching Darrell Clarke play. That England game that I was talking about was the one where he got injured in. I think he did his pec or something, but actually when he came onto the pitch, it really changed the sort of speed and direction of that game. And he's had a big say in the Challenge Cup final last year where he won the man of the match. He won Man of Steel in the first year of the Super League pod. I think that was when he won it, 2014. So we talked tons and tons about what a great player he was at that stage. Sarah, what do you think of Darrell Clarke? Do you think he's an exciting player? Kind of player that does give those heart-pumping moments of exhilaration that Lee describes?
I think Warrington are definitely a better team with him on the pitch. I think he does. I think he's more than just what he does. I think it's what he gives to the team as well. If that makes sense.
It does make sense. The hidden thing about Darrell Clarke, to me, has always been the defensive side of his game. As we see the attacking side. The fact that he averages pretty much 10 metres per carry every single season when he's running out a dummy half all the time is unbelievable. But it's the tackling he does, and no one really talks about his defence. We'll talk about Danny Houghton's defence. We'll talk about Cameron Smith's defence. We'll talk about James Roby's, about Sam Powell's, even about someone like McAlorum, who's a different type of defender. But we never talk about Darrell Clarke's defence, but let me tell you, it's also outstanding.
I feel he's a dependable, he's a consistent player, isn't he? He might not get all the accolades that you feel like he deserves, but that's because he does it week in, week out.
Yeah,
so you never think, Darrell Clarke had a really good game today, because that's kind of what you just expect from him. Yeah,
because after that season 2014, that's what he did, wasn't it? He had really great games, and we were kind of a bit surprised because he was a young guy. I think he was Young Player of the Year and Man of Steel, weren't he, at the same year? Whereas once he moved to Warrington for that big transfer fee and stuff, kind of people, I don't know, expected him to be the best player on the pitch in a team that now had lots of stars, whereas he was in a team that didn't have lots of stars before that. And so maybe, like you say, he kind of got overlooked a little bit because of that. But I think he's great. What did Alan have to say when we're talking about consistent players? Alan starts to talk about one of the most consistent ever. Sarah,
me?
To do Alan.
Sorry.
No, sorry, that's me.
So Alan said, best ever. Rugby is a complete player and plays in the right spirit, which is why I discount Cam Smith. Best of all, really enjoyed Ian Henderson in the Purslers era Bradford side. Made the crucial difference to push us to the title in 2005.
So there's a few to unpack there. James Lowe's gets a mention, even though it's kind of a mention in passing, but I mean, he was brilliant for that early Super League Bradford side, playing in 4 grand finals, scoring tries. God, he used to be able to, he was the one hooker I feared back then. I didn't really, as a Wigan fan, I didn't really fear Cunningham that much. I think we managed to raise our game against St Helens, but against Bradford, I really feared him close to the line, Jimmy Lowes. Ian Henderson I just thought was okay, but he had a couple of great years at the Bulls. But
I was going to say, I really wouldn't have ever put Ian Henderson in there as a great. It's interesting, isn't it? How, as a fan of a team, obviously you see a lot more than somebody who only sees them, twice a year when they play against your team, and then however many times you manage to see them on telly. But yeah, Henderson, I almost felt was just sort of a filler in.
It was definitely it never really felt like he was your 80-minute banker hooker. But he did have a few important involvements, like Alan said, in that post Lowe's era. But surely, if anyone said to you Bradford Bulls hookers, the first thing you would think about is Jimmy Lowes, isn't it?
Yeah, and then secondly, I'd think about Paul Deacon having to cover there.
Yeah. Well, also, I wouldn't even say he was necessarily the best Henderson brother.
Well, Andrew Henderson, I think, was the one who played more international games for Scotland. He was the Sheffield one, wasn't he, as well? So
Sheffield, Barrow, Broncos at the end of his career.
I think that's where Andrew Henderson falls down, in that he didn't play as much of his time in the Super League. So actually, we've got a great one to talk about on that regard later on in the chat. But James Roby, as a Wigan fan, there's no St Helens player who I admire, respect, and undoubtedly think is one of the greatest, I'd say, 3 or 4 players to have played in the Super League over its entire span than James Roby. I don't think I've ever watched him play a game where he doesn't get injured that he doesn't play 8 or 9 out of 10. And I can't think of many players that I can say that about. Obviously, I don't see every one of his games. Like Sarah said, we only see them a couple of times live, and then Saints we see a lot on telly, obviously, as well. But James Roby is an absolutely fantastic player. And do you know what? He gets away with playing the game in the right spirit, because he never does anything dirty, does he? He never does anything dirty. He is very cheeky, but because he's so nice, he gets away. I think he was the player that invented the holding the... You know when the ref started pulling people up on getting the hands around the ball carrying arm? I think he was the one that invented pulling the wrist on the other arm, because I saw him do it so many times that season where penalty after penalty was getting given when the hand was near the ball, but Roby never got penalised, but he always tugged on that other arm just at the end of a tackle and put the player off balance and slowed things down. Very clever player. Not nasty, and fantastic player, isn't he?
Just, I mean, for me, he's up there on my list of just someone I just enjoy watching as a hook, and just the threat and everything, and also his defence, his ability just to knuckle in and work down, and he's not. Also, he knows his own body and his own game. He knows when to spell himself out a bit and when to conserve his energy and when to go. He doesn't try and do every flashy play every time. He spots the opportunity and goes for it, and he's brilliant at that. But he also knows when to pull himself in.
And I think, Wigan fans love to have a go at him sort of playing 40 minutes a game and winning the Man of Steel and stuff, because we all thought Trent Barrett should have won it that year, but in 2007. But really, Roby didn't just play half a game. He actually would stay on. He was that important that they would, when they brought Cunningham back on, Roby would stay on the pitch too, because he was that good, that influential, that important, that they wanted both of them at the end of games, and it was one of the reasons why you wouldn't write off the Saints and all of those, cheesy lines. But Roby's for me the best 9 that's played in Super League. In terms of, when you combine ability, performance in big moments, and longevity, I'd say he's the best for me. But David Lawrenson got in touch at David Lorrow. He said, Terry Newton, his unfailing ability to wind up and piss off the Aussies was massively underused in internationals. Sadly missed and much loved from this corner. Yeah, we talked a little bit about Terry Newton. Terry Newton was my first hooker, as it were. So when I first went watching Wigan, he was still at Leeds